So we are just waiting for everybody to come into our webinar today. Thank you to everyone who is joining us. The attendee count is going up. We're just going to give it a minute to make sure that everybody has a chance to get in before we get started so that you get the full experience of this amazing webinar that we're doing today with the Fine-Tune team. As you can see, Mike Cadio is going to be joining us in this conversation today, and he's got a lot to contribute on the MRO side, and I think that you're going to find that this is going to be an amazing discussion all about nuisance expenses. Well, what is a nuisance expense? Well, you're just going to have to wait and see, because we are going to talk about that just in a minute. So we'll just give it just a couple more seconds just to make sure we get everybody in, and then we can get started.
Hi, Sarah. Hi, Rich. How are you guys?
Hey, Mike. Doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're here. I'm really excited about this. I think that the Procurement Foundry community is going to get a lot of value out of this. I know that a lot of folks are looking to new ideas and new places to save money. So, and I know that you're definitely got a lot of expertise, at least in the pre-call. So I'm really excited to see how this all goes.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you too, Sarah.
Yeah, I had Fine-Tune on the show a couple of weeks back, and it was a great episode. Just going through where they came from, where they are going. They're doing so many incredible things in the procurement space, and we can't wait to tell you all about it. So I think we're just going to get started. It's been a couple of minutes. We've still got some people coming in, but let's just get started. So welcome, everyone. You know, as procurement professionals, business professionals, how do you feel when I say the word uniform? What about waste management? And last but not least, pest management. You might be confused, they might make you sweat, but I am here to tell you that these nuisance expenses should bring you joy. You know why? These are the spend categories that can bring you the most savings you have in the right processes in place. So before I introduce you to our guest, let's do some housekeeping. We are going to be taking questions throughout the webinar today, so make sure to submit your questions in the Q&A function so that we can ask Rich the questions as he is going through his presentation. And let's get to know a little bit more about Rich right now. So here with me to talk about the priority of these under the radar nuisance expenses is Rich Ham. He is the CEO of Fine-Tune, and in early 2002, Rich resigned a position within an industry leading uniform supplier and founded Fine-Tune in a basement in Bloomington, Indiana. He oversees all the areas of business with a particular focus on the firm's overall strategic direction. Rich dedicates his time to building and developing the team of tuners and engaging with the major and national clientele. And also with us today, as I mentioned earlier, Mike Cadio is here. He's the founder of Procurement Foundry, and he's going to be talking with us about nuisance expenses and what that means in MRO space. So hi, Rich. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to you to help us understand the biggest mistakes procurement professionals make when it comes to nuisance expenses.
Hey, Sarah. Thank you for having me. We will introduce our firm briefly at 30,000 feet. Then we'll transition into talking a little bit about nuisance expenses, why we think they're optimal for third-party management, and what the dilemmas are that face the category managers who own them at their particular business. And then finally, you got to have some optimism, right? What can you do about it besides bemoaning your fate as the owner of a nuisance expense category? So good news, there's solutions at the end. But for starters, Fine-Tune, you know, of course, we occupy that arena of the consulting world that is, you know, it's comprised of firms that are typically staffed by guys and gals that used to work in industry X, and now they sell a service that says, hey, buddy, I'll save you some money on X, or I'll advance your interests within X if you'll share the proceeds or the savings, the gains with me. We are one of those. Utilize in most of our engagements, a shared savings revenue model And we are indeed staffed by high-level experts from within our areas of expertise. But I want to stress a little bit about how we've differentiated ourselves within that space. So within that arena, there are some firms out there that are particularly or almost exclusively focused on auditing, maybe tax audit firms or utility audit firms that will come in, look at the money you've spent in their space over the last year or 3 years or 5 years, find overpayments, get you refund checks to flow back into your organization and share those in some negotiated percentage. Auditing is a big part of what we do. We have in fact developed proprietary auditing software and expense management software built around the industries that we specialize in, but it's only one part of what we do. So elsewhere in that same arena, you're going to find firms that are much more focused on deal making, sourcing firms that will come in and say, I'll put you in a new and better contract in X, Y, and Z categories. And then there'll be some mechanism involved in the relationship for projecting the impact of that new and better deal. They get paid for their sourcing work and they go on their merry way. Contract negotiation, RFP processes, sourcing, deal making is also a big part of what we do. But again, it's just a part of what we do. So how we've really differentiated ourselves within our broader arena of the consulting world is by being a full service solution, a nose to tail category management solution that allows our clients to check out of the categories that we're managing so that they can focus on other expenses. And that kind of dovetails into our discussion of nuisance expenses. We've come to believe over time that nuisance expenses are the optimal expenses for outsourced management, as long as you find the right outsourced manager, as long as you find the right experts that have the right combination of expertise and tools to deliver real value so that you can focus on other areas of your business. And, you know, we've got a series of slides that are kind of dedicated to why it is that nuisance expenses are so particularly ripe for expert management outside the organization. Stop me at any point. Let's make it conversational. You know, the first dilemma that faces the category manager who owns, say, 20 different categories, a few of which are what we would describe as nuisance expenses, is that there's this unhealthy relationship between monetary priority and management time, right? You have a buyer who maybe he's got a $2 million a year uniform program and he's responsible for $50 million total dollars on an annual basis. All right, so uniforms is 4% of that buyer's total sphere of responsibility. You would hope that for every 100 hours that buyer spends on his or her portfolio of expenditures, not more than 4 or so are being dedicated to uniforms. And yet it tends to be 2 times, 3 times, 5 times that amount. There tends to be a really outsized requirement of management time if you're going to truly effectively manage these categories. What ends up happening is, of course, the buyers don't have that kind of time. They can't marshal that kind of time, can't justify dedicating that kind of time to these smaller categories. And as a result, the suppliers in these industries tend not to be very closely managed. And as a result, the margins are high. So you have their nuisances on a number of levels: low monetary priority, high management time, and yet high margin. And what you really want to find ideally is a solution that can take your management time down to nil or virtually nil, while dramatically shrinking those supplier margins, putting you in a more competitive place while you're remaining mission focused in other areas of your business.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because I've heard, a lot of times with these categories that we're looking at a long turnaround time. Professionals aren't looking at these categories every year. They're looking at them maybe every second year. Why is that? And I think that, obviously with everything that's going on right now, we've got teams that are shrinking. We've got less time to be able to spend on these nuisance expenses. Why is it so important for them to really take a look at this on an ongoing basis?
Well, and we've got a slide in about 3 slides that I won't spoil, so I won't go too deep in answering that, but I will tell you that you're right. In fact, in uniforms, it's frequently every 5 years where it really gets the attention of the deal-making department. Procurement very frequently is a once every 4 or 5 years dive into uniforms in when it comes to revisiting contracts.
Wow.
Waste disposal every 3, sometimes 2 to 3. Pest control maybe on an annual basis, but that one is, it also brings an element of scariness for procurement. They tend to defer more to quality, and as a result, costs don't get paid the attention that it probably should get paid during most sourcing events. So, but yeah, you're right. For the most part, these are not expenses that garner the attention of procurement and expense management professionals more than every multiple years. And unfortunately, the rub is what is required is a certain constant, dedicated, vigilant management if you actually want your efforts to turn out working, to actually to result in true cost savings and to result in the size of the checks that are going out the door shrinking. And so it's critical, and it's actually something I'm going to very smoothly just move along to the next slide, because we talk about these nuisance expense dilemmas. The next one involves the nature of the categories themselves. If you think of every expense that a particular buyer is responsible for as falling somewhere on a spectrum from simple widgets out to complex services, nuisance expenses reside way out at the complex service end of the spectrum, where you're going to find all kinds of moving parts, discretionary charges where suppliers have the ability to apply various peripheral fees and charges according to their discretion. Their discretion tends to get more aggressive in the immediate wake of a sourcing event that was supposed to save 20 or 30%. There's an immediate attempt to reclaim those lost margins.
Right.
Various supplier practices, and then I would really hammer away at this last bullet here, the unknown unknowns. I mean, when I think of my clients, I think of highly intelligent people that are very good at their jobs and know more than I do about 47 of the 50 things they've touched in their careers. And yet, in the 3 spaces that we're so deeply immersed, there are always a handful of unknown unknowns. And with nuisance expenses, the suppliers in those industries have become very adept at capitalizing on the unknown unknowns. If you got 95% of a contract right, but there was 5% you missed because you just didn't know stuff you didn't know, your suppliers in these spaces are probably going to be able to exploit that 5% miss to the tune of 20, 25, or 30% hard dollar costs. And so that's kind of the nature of nuisance expenses. And the way I would sum this up is, if you're looking for an optimal expense to outsource to a firm that brings a certain level of expertise, that's subject matter expertise, it should be an expense where that expertise is likely to yield real value, is likely to be worth a lot. And I'm sure there's more to know about ball bearings than I would think. There probably is more complexity to the ball bearing world than I would think of, because I don't understand the first thing about ball bearings. But I know that at the complex service end of the spectrum, we frequently say about the uniform category, for example, it's not a 3-card Monty, it's a 3,000-card Monty. There are so many things to keep track of that even the most astute buyers can't possibly be expected to understand it all.
Well, and I think so. I know Mike wants to jump in here, and I kind of want to jump in here because we were talking about this yesterday. And, with everything going on with COVID, I think this is a great place to jump in here with some of the contract terms that we should keep an eye on, right? Because you're talking about unknown unknowns. And this is we're living in one of the biggest ones right now. So, let's talk a little bit more about that. What terms in a contract should we keep an eye on moving forward? I mean, especially during COVID.
The COVID pandemic has given us, has really illuminated one of the areas that tends to be so frequently undervalued, if it's valued at all, in contracting processes. And it really applies across all of our offerings, particularly uniforms and waste. Uniforms is really in the spotlight right now for this one. And that is how you've contemplated your back end or end of contract liabilities in your agreement. We find that procurement will very frequently short shrift this area of a contract because it doesn't tie directly in the short term to savings, okay? And it's not going to affect the number you report. But if you're taking an ownership-minded approach to the contracting, you have to recognize the liabilities that your uniform contract or your waste contract is bringing into the organization. And this is on full display right now. Our clients in industry, for example, are laying off employees, in some cases en masse. All right. And with a uniform program, when employees get laid off en masse, there is product that they have been wearing that is not theirs. It is the property of their uniform supplier. And
Right.
uniform contracts have language, if you've signed up for the standard language, for example, that requires that that product be returned in, quote, good and usable condition, either at the end of term or when employees are removed from the program. Well, you can imagine after you've worked 2 or 3 years in a steel plant, your uniforms aren't in good and usable condition. Hopefully they're usable. Okay, that's about the greatest standard you could hope for after that duration of time in that environment. And so normally those terms get short shrifted. They don't get paid much attention to on the front end contracting. And it's not until now when you realize, wow, I'm on the hook for this and I'm getting billed for hundreds of thousands of dollars for lost and damaged merchandise as I take it out of my accounts, that you realize, wow, that was kind of important. I should have paid more attention to that 3 or 5 years ago. Of course, our experts have been mindful of this even in times where it's, not a crisis situation. But
Well, it's not only that. I think too, with employees not using the uniforms, right?
yeah,
Because of furlough and different things that are happening. I think, we were talking about this yesterday that, there's some companies out there that are putting it on hold, but unless you are working directly with your supplier on a day-to-day basis, in the uniform space, depending on what's happening with your business and your employees, how much money are you really leaving on the table?
yeah, and you alluded to it. We're seeing a wide spectrum of responses from the suppliers in the industry, and that one in particular, ranging from, and actually it applies to waste industry too, in terms of the reduction of scope of services, removal of containers, reduction of frequency of servicing. We're seeing everything from very cooperative and helpful to combative and desperate. And this is not, there are certain practices that we've seen across organizations, but there also is some decision-making left to the local operations within these broad national organizations. And so we're seeing a huge spectrum of behaviors. You have to recognize what you can and can't control. You can control the terms you put in place for your company. You can control how out in front of things you are along the way. You can try to control your inventories and make sure you're not carrying products you don't need. But also there are certain things that you can't control. And we like to think that having, an expert advocate is helpful to our clients in these, difficult times.
Mike, did you want to jump in here?
Oh my God, it's been 18 minutes on a webinar and I haven't been able to speak it. I'm freaking out over here.
You must be.
Rich, thank you very much for coming. I think this is an amazing topic. First things first, from one guy sitting in a basement to a guy who started his company in a basement. Congratulations, man. It sounds like you got an amazing business. And I love, one thing I can tell you as a former chief procurement officer who was in completely indirect world his whole life, no supply chain management. I didn't buy polymers and paints and spray on enamels and things like that to build combine harvesters. I was in a very large intellectual property shop with an advertising firm. His workplace is a huge spend, right? Whether it's real estate or rent or security systems and things like that. And exactly like you said, you gotta focus. You only have so many people when you're in a leadership role at the individual category levels, and once you get past rent and real estate in that workplace space, it's kind of the 80-20 rule. It's like, okay, everything beyond rent is tail spend, and we'll just let it be there. And I think you made an amazing point, which is when things go unchecked, the margins tend to creep up, right?
Yeah.
And because of that, you've got a community of vendor population that are servicing you in uniforms and waste disposal and removal and pest control and things like that. That's not something you're going to hire somebody into a category level of spend because of their expertise in that space. It's going to be, oh yeah, by the way, when I had a free couple of minutes, I worked on that stuff, right?
100%.
Because at the end of the day, you take a multi-billion-dollar company that's got $300, $400, $500 million worth of rent and real estate in that workplace category, the way we break out spend analytics and indirect spend, it's in there with the rents and the safety, securities, and the travels of the world, and catering services and things like that.
Sure.
So this is, without a shadow of a doubt, for me, this is a place where the Procurement Foundry members who are in category management, we got a lot of people in Procurement Foundry, and I would just get off of a phone call with some others that are, jack of all trades inside of a company, into a mid-market company, and they're staffed up on 1 or 2 people, right? And so for somebody to be able to get knowledge of this and to buy the expertise that you bring to the table, for me, is really, really interesting. So I think that this is perfect fit. I mean, there's nobody I know who's in the Procurement Foundry, with maybe some real few exceptions, that has an expertise in uniform contract management, even if they're in the manufacturing space, right?
Well,
We haven't found it yet. We just don't, any background in our targeted categories that I've ever found in a procurement department has been kind of a random oddity. That certainly wasn't why they were hired. Maybe years back, they did a few years at waste management or whatever, but no. And as a result, I think an important offshoot of that, Mike, is that buyers' education in these categories, almost by necessity, historically at least, has come from their suppliers. Yeah. And anytime you're getting educated about your categories by your suppliers, I would argue that's fraught with peril. That's a perilous situation. You need an education that comes from at least somewhere else beyond your incumbent and their competitors. That's not good enough to give you the real story. I'm an old journalism major, so the straight dope, if you will, about your categories. You need somebody that doesn't have a dog in the race.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that it marginalizes your opportunity for efficiency if all you're getting for knowledge out of that is your vendor community. But again, on those things that are lower down the totem pole, quite honestly, they don't have a lot of time to actually go out and do market research. One of the things we try to do at Procurement Foundry is offer them a place where they can collaborate and communicate on that. But having access to somebody like yourself and bringing you in for a hired gun on a quick hit on something like that, and the fact that you said you are a nose to tail service and you're not just a sourcing company and you're ongoing vendor management and support services around that, really, really brings some value to it, in my opinion.
I want to stress, it's not me. There is a team of tuners below me that runs absolute circles around me, and the real experts are in that layer of the business and the teams below them. I've learned more about our targeted industries while at Fine Tune in the last 18 years and change than I knew before I started the business. But below me is a team of absolute wizards and highest level experts.
Okay. Great. Let's keep this going. What do you have next for us?
Well, and this really gets to the heart of the dilemma, kind of what the two prior, everything kind of flows together. The result of the nature of nuisance expenses, of the complexity and all the unknown unknowns, is there tends to be a tremendous gap, an unusual gap between negotiation and execution. And so what you have, there's a phenomenon that we see all the time within our targeted categories, and it's good contract, bad deal. Procurement guy or gal did awesome work 3 years ago, and when we're in data collection mode, often the first thing that comes to us is the agreement, and then invoice data follows. Okay, and so we see the agreement first frequently, and we'll be looking at it and go, wow, it's a good contract. Of course, there's some things we've changed, and they missed this and they missed this, but 92% of it's rock solid. And then the invoicing comes in, and half of it bears no resemblance to the contract. They're products and services and charges that weren't even contemplated 3 years ago. And then a slice of it's just flat out non-compliant. Contract says this, invoice says something different. And then there's line items where there's inventories, 5,000 of this product, and you get to the site and you realize there's only 1,500 of them. The invoice says 5,000, but 3,500 of them didn't exist. And so there are all these factors, myriad factors associated with these categories that erode the efforts of procurement very quickly after the ink hits the paper. Take pest control, for example. You go to the market and you shrink your your $1.5 million a year pest control program to 1.1 million, or so you think, right? But what do you know that next year and the year after, your pest control partners are coming to you telling you, you need to do fogging and fumigation events in your plants. You've had a colony of a certain insect infesting plant number 23 in Wichita, and you've got to do this event every year now, and it's $100,000 a shot. And the same thing's happening in Waco, Texas, to the tune of another $75,000 every year. Now, is every year the right frequency for those charges, for those events? Are there underlying factors that could be repaired and fixed that would eliminate the need? Probably, and often, in many cases, yes. But the fox is guarding the hen house in these cases. It's the very supplier that relies on the margins telling you you need to spend the money, and it's the very supplier that you just thought you saved $400,000 with. And so, there are just so many factors that are attacking your bottom line within these categories after the work of procurement is done. And so what we find is good contract, bad deal.
Yeah. And you bring up a lot of really great points, because if you don't have somebody that knows these categories, that are watching them on a regular basis, and you're only taking a look at them every 3 years, I can see how much money is really being left on the table. If you've got somebody, and it's not just, it's really about the contract, and it's about the terms, and it's about, what the supplier is telling you need versus what you actually really need and what you need to be spending on. And if you don't know what that looks like, then you're just going to say yes, and you're going to be spending money all over the place.
It's a great point, and I want to even go a step further to say, I want to be clear that not all things that erode the efforts of procurement are related to a supplier competing to defend their bottom line. And in the natural buyer-seller joust, some of them are things that just legitimately change that you couldn't have hoped to contemplate 3 years ago when you were revisiting your deal. Maybe your safety department comes out with a new requirement that all your employees in the steel mills now wear high visibility garments because there were some instances involving, forklift or safety related concerns in dimly lit plants. So now everybody has to move into high visibility uniforms. Well, you didn't consider high visibility uniforms when you negotiated the deal 2 years ago, and now you're dealing from a position of weakness. You're forced to assimilate this new product addition midstream into your contract. And of course, at that time that comes up, you're working on something else. You weren't deeply immersed in uniforms. This came to you unexpectedly midway through your contract, and you had to just add the product and move on with your life. So, we did a project for an account a couple of years back where the contract was so good we weren't even sure there was going to be opportunity. And then we got our hands on the invoicing, and we saw only 37% of the spend was even contemplated in the contract. And that part was razor thin margin, really good deal. The other 63% was a hot mess. And in the end, we were able to save the account 35% or so, because so much of what was going on at the invoice level wasn't even contemplated in the contract.
I mean, I'm sorry, Sarah.
No, go ahead. No, I was just going to say, it brings up a good point with the, you don't necessarily need to change suppliers. You just need to get really good and get somebody in to look at the finite details versus what you're actually paying for and figuring that out. Sorry, Mike, go ahead.
No, again, I think this is a fantastic topic, because even with really good spend analytics, which we're starting to see in indirect and direct procurement spaces, right? Some spend analytics tools will say, hey, listen, our budget for that particular contract was $50,000 a month, and we're averaging in at $125,000 a month because of all these additional services or expansion of services, or, like you said, we didn't realize that we needed high visibility clothing on some of our third-party vendors that are in the building that we're providing uniforms to, and now all of a sudden that's an add-on expense, right?
Absolutely.
And the reason why is because, again, it's systematically a bit of a smaller number, and because of that, it doesn't necessarily get the attention that it does. But if I've got the ability to be able to bring somebody in like yourself who's going to understand, hey, listen, now's the right trigger point for us to go back and renegotiate that deal because we've gone over 135 or 150% against what was in the contract. And we really need to sit back down with them and talk about, hey, listen, either we're going to renegotiate a price point down, or we're going to restructure the term of the agreement or something like that. I think it's just, it's good practice right now. And I think that, some of the tools are out there that start to help this. But again, I think they got to keep coming back to folks like you who understand this, because quite candidly, it reminds me a lot of the argument that I had once with and I know we've got some of these folks on the discussion today, facilities management firms, right? So you negotiate a huge facilities management firm with a Jones Lang LaSalle or CBRE or somebody like that, right? And they charge you X amount of dollars to vacuum the rugs in the offices, right? But they're vacuuming the same damn rug, whether there's been anybody in the room or not for that week. And it's like, listen, there's nobody even on that floor this month.
Right.
Stop vacuuming the rugs, right? And cut that down. So, but if you're not watching it, like waste removal, like, hey, I'm paying somebody for waste removal, there's nothing in the trash cans this month because there's nobody on that piece of business this month, or that particular production line's been shut down, right? So if you're not proactively managing that and watching it almost on a day-to-day basis, you could be leaving some really significant dollars on the table, right?
Well, and it's one of the obvious costs of lean procurement, and I think it's fair to say that to whatever extent we've been operating in a lean procurement era, it's about to become more so, right? The people are going to have to continue to find creative ways to manage more spend, more contracts, and more responsibilities. And so, but one of the costs of structuring your corporate that way, and your procurement department that way, is you don't have the resources to engage in vigilant, dedicated, continuous management across a broad spectrum of expenses. And so, you've got a choice. You can either not just decide it's a cost of doing business and you're going to overspend in your tail spend, and particularly on nuisance expenses, or you can try to find a strategy that brings a certain level of dedication and vigilance to it. Because look, when I use a phrase like the joust with your suppliers, I don't use it to denigrate the suppliers involved. There's a healthy joust. It's competition. We all, everybody has a responsibility to their shareholders. Waste management has responsibilities to its shareholders. The leaders in the pest control and uniform industries do too. If you're not engaged in the joust along with them, you're likely to lose. It's your job to come up with strategies to manage your full portfolio of expenses and defend your bottom line, and also, frankly, defend yourself from getting too sucked into lesser priorities, so that you're not doing what you should be doing with your biggest priorities. And so we always say, if you're not engaged in the joust in these categories, you're probably losing.
Well, and let's use today, for example, right? I mean, what we're going through right now, how many offices are empty at the moment, and you're still paying for maybe waste management on garbage containers that might be empty?
It's true. And of course, the terms you've got in place are critical. And then just working through these times with your suppliers. It is a time where there's probably some give and take involved in a lot of accounts. You may be falling below certain minimum thresholds that either party thought was remotely in the cards, and all of a sudden it's real. And so, it's a time to work through all that. But circling back, and I'm going to go ahead, Sarah, and jump forward here, because this was the slide I warned you was, I didn't want to give it away too early, but what we find within these categories is what you have every few years, where there's a procurement event, costs come down. Now, what I want to really stress here is, take this first event here, this year one event. Probably the intent of the year one event was that it got you to here, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, it's probably pretty fair to say that the savings that was reported in this event was this kind of savings right here. And yet, when the deal implementation was flawed and the supplier immediately started, reclaiming some of their lost margins through the strategies we've talked about over time, and the dust settled at the end of year one, the result was really here. But either way, something good happened. The bottom line interests of the company were advanced. But then you're back faced with all the same realities of the nuisance expense categories that we discussed to begin with. And then there's another event. And then it creeps up 3 years. And then there's another event. And you're on that roller coaster. It's like the old definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. I've encouraged so many buyers through the years to look back at their 10-year arc in the areas that we specialize in. Don't just look at the last year, look 10 years back. and trace the evolution where you have sourcing or procurement event followed by 2, 3, 4 years of inactivity, and look at what happens in those intervening years and watch it happen again. And then ask yourself, do I want to deliver a real solution for my organization that drives costs down with an optimal open market activity, optimizes from there to find true rock bottom with non-contractual activities, demand management, et cetera, inventory optimization. And then when we find rock bottom, keeping it there over time. Isn't that the perfect arc of any expense in any organization? Drive it down further, keep it there. And what you find when you're stuck on the roller coaster is the costs of nuisance expenses go way beyond their hard dollar costs. And one of the important ones that I'll hammer home on the next slide is the reputational cost for procurement within an organization. We find that the areas that we specialize in are very often sources of friction between procurement and P&L owners and operators elsewhere in an organization, because the promises of procurement tend to get broken. And I'm not saying that's the fault of procurement. Sometimes it's partly that because of that, but a lot of it's just the reality, the nature of the expenses we're talking about, where promises tend to get broken because the efforts of procurement are so quickly eroded. And so, what we're trying to do is get our clients off the nuisance expense roller coaster and onto a healthier track.
Awesome. Yeah, I like that blue arc better.
Oh, I'll go back to it.
I think
the blue arc is better. It is a healthy, good business arc. You're right. P&L owners and operators will like that arc.
I think what you're seeing here, though, this is a perfect example of what procurement would like to see from a blue angle, right?
Yeah.
And what sales wants to see on the other side of your vendor population, which is, I'm willing to do a fallback position, and I'm willing to do a fallback position on those 2-year, 3-year events, right? When I have to get back in the room and hammer out some hardcore negotiations with you, I'm willing to give you up some incremental decreases in cost basis, but I'm going to be upselling you for the next 2 years of our relationship anyway. So by the time I get to that point, what I have to fall back and give you as reclaim is actually better than where I was 2 years ago when we started this thing. I mean, that is a perfect example of what a sales cycle growth pattern over 10 years looks like. And there's a whole bunch of vendors in procurement, both on the supply chain and on the indirect and on the direct side, that chart looks just like that. I mean, it's a perfect example.
Well,
Go ahead, Sarah.
No, go ahead, because we have a question. I'll ask the question after you're done.
Well, Mike, along the lines of what you just said, we've found on occasion that a supplier made the mistake of assuming with us involved that they would enjoy the same margin creep over time that they always had. And so the unit rates that they put forth in an agreement were truly underwater if they were actually adhered to over time. And I've had vendors, this just happened a couple weeks back, I had a vendor come to me and say, I just want to prepare you for the fact that we're going to need a price increase in this next deal, or we're going to have to walk from it. And I had to explain to my client, it's actually legit. Our experts have looked at this deal. They are underwater. We've gotten away with being below optimal market cost levels for the last few years. And we're probably going to get reeled into just optimal market cost levels where it's, a razor thin margin deal, yes, but the supplier still wants the business. So yeah, we've seen that happen over time. And certainly they do come to the table with that assumption that it'll be business as usual after the business. Go ahead, Sarah. I'm eager to hear the question.
Well, yeah, and that's an interesting point as well, because you obviously want to work with your suppliers and make sure that it's a win-win on both sides. Otherwise, it really doesn't work for anybody. So Julie has come up with a question. How do you measure or ensure that the quality of service provided doesn't also decrease with cost decrease? And that's a great question. So I'm going to turn that over to you, Rich.
Yeah, it's critical. I mean, certainly we have a dog in the race in terms of wanting that to happen because, and I'll back out for a moment, 85% of our clients retain their incumbent suppliers. And that largely mirrors the industry-wide statistics within a really close range. We talk way more clients out of switching to new suppliers than we talk into it. Normally, we find that the status quo can be repaired with a supplier. But I think the answer, and was it Julie's question?
Yeah,
The
Julie.
answer to Julie's question is that when you bring a certain level of expert into the equation, the people, like I know that the people that our leadership is talking to on the supplier side, in many cases, they're the exact people, but in other cases, they're at least the equivalent within their organization. They're speaking to people that would have or could have reported to them in a past life. You know, they're the senior most executives that have probably along the way in their careers held the exact positions that the people they're talking to are currently working in. And so they're able to speak their language. They're able to cut to the chase and say, here's what you really need to do to keep this customer happy. Here's the way to handle it back in your plant. Here's the way to handle it on the service day. Here's the way to handle your inspections. And so, you know, being able to speak the supplier's language, I think, is a huge advantage. Knowing, you know, we very frequently tell our clients that their expectations are out of whack, that there's no supplier on earth. A lot of times, I warned earlier about the dangers of getting your education exclusively from your supplier and their competitors. One of the dangers is non-incumbents that are coming in to sell you, leading you to believe that certain things, certain expectations are reasonable when they're actually not.
Right.
We've told many of our clients, like, that supplier up the street isn't going to fix this problem. You're never going to have pristine uniforms doing what you do. they're not going to ever come back clean.
Yeah,
You know, that's just not happening. And so, that I think setting fair expectations. But yeah, we spend a decent amount of time defending suppliers to our clients and explaining to them this is not, you're not getting better than this. And I think that has its way of tamping down the emotions on all sides of the equation too. Just dealing with the facts.
Yeah. And thank you, Julie. I think that was a really, really great question. So Rich, we've got about 18 minutes left. I know we've got a lot of really good information still to come. So let's keep it rolling.
Sure. And we'll wrap up the presentation shortly, but I did want to spend at least a moment here on making sure to reinforce the true cost of nuisance expenses. You know, you have here your legitimate contracted spend, the spend you thought you were signing up for when you signed the deal, and that should happen if everything goes well. But on those very same invoices, as it turns out, and growing over time, by the way, are avoidable costs. Some of it's non-compliance. Some of it is inventory that appears as a number on an invoice but isn't really there at your plant. And so that rolls right into your true costs, even though it wasn't what you were projecting at the time you did the deal. We've also addressed this one, accrued hidden liabilities, liabilities that only rear their ugly head at the worst time, like a crisis, where all of a sudden you're laying off hundreds or thousands of employees, and you're like, geez, right when I thought our invoices were going to shrink, I'm going about a 2-month period where my invoices are 8 times what they normally would be. If you have a flame-resistant uniform program, by the way, and you go to lay off 200 people, it is likely that those 200 people will see invoicing from their supplier equal to 6 months of normal service in that moment. Right when you thought you were about to save money, your costs went way up. So accrued hidden liabilities is part of the cost equation in a true evaluation of a nuisance expense, but also the opportunity cost because of distractions, right? Is this the kind of expense that sucks me in and diverts my focus from more mission critical activities? Absolutely. That's the nature of these expenses. That's a part of the cost too. And it is possible, by the way, we've built models for individual clients that actually tie numbers to these elements. It's not like it's impossible to say, well, how much time and what am I worth? And what is ultimately the opportunity cost of my spending 12 hours a week on uniforms and waste disposal, or whatever the case may be.
Great.
And then finally, the hard dollar company labor. I mean, just how many FTEs do you throw at the category, and how could that change if you adopted a different strategy? And then finally, not depicted in this table, but over here, procurement's reputation. It's hard to put a number to that, but there is a cost of dealing in the kinds of categories where your efforts don't tend to really come to light over time. There is a cost to that when P&L owners and operators go, well, yeah, you told me this was going to be 30%, but it's not even half that. Well, maybe it might not even been your fault. It was other things that happened throughout the organization, but the nature of these categories is that it creates friction between procurement and operations. So there's a lot of costs that don't tend to get, I think, fully appreciated on the front end. And I want to we're always encouraging our prospects and clients to make sure that their equations for evaluating the various ways forward that they might take have a starting point that appreciates the full cost of these categories.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that, because I think that it shows us, the overhead, the total holistic view of the overhead of the cost of these expenses if they aren't managed properly, not only from, a contract perspective, but also from an internal business perspective and what that actually means to the business bottom line.
100%. And it's just, it always pains me when I see a decision process that's incomplete, because I know, for example, that one of our largest clients, company in the automotive world, used to budget for 2 full-time equivalents for their waste and recycling program. Now they budget for 0.25.
Yeah.
And that's in addition to all the hard dollar cost savings we've driven out of their account. There is also a continuous benefit of having freed up 1.75 people on an ongoing basis. And if those people didn't get fired, they got handed higher priority initiatives and were able to grow in the organization because they were kind of unburdened from these nuisance categories.
That's huge. The wave effect of how it's affecting not only, the full-time employees that are dealing with this, but, everybody around them and what it means for them as an individual in opportunity as well. So
Agreed.
I think that's great.
So I promised you optimism at the end. What can you do about it? The first 2 bullets are kind of obvious to anybody in, an expense management role. And of course, you want to try to gain a good understanding of the status quo. I will say, because of the complexities of the categories we deal in, even that first bullet is really, really hard. I mean, take in the uniform industry, for example, the leading national suppliers don't even agree on the definition of the word inventory. They define the word inventory differently. And unless you understand the nuances of those differences and all the ripple effects that manifest on your invoice because of the differences in how they define inventory, I mean, you're starting at a distinct disadvantage. And that's like one of the most obvious ones. There are so many tiny little nuanced differences between the way this supplier, and this supplier handles things. Same thing goes for the waste and pest industries too. So, but, that would be step number 1. Try to gain that true nuanced understanding of the status quo, and then use that intel to go about smart open market activities. That's all great. And it's what my clients have been endeavoring to do for years before they met us. It's what the people, that are a part of Procurement Foundry know. It's second nature. That's like the job. But with nuisance expenses in particular, unless you've put strategies in place as part of your expense management strategy to ensure ongoing auditing, optimization of the spend on an ongoing basis, and perhaps most importantly, protections against distractions from unless you've put some kind of a strategy in place to ensure that what used to be a nuisance now becomes an area of opportunity for you to drive real cost savings and also to win over your internal customers, operators, P&L owners, et cetera. A strategy without those elements is doomed to failure, and it puts you back on the roller coaster. But if you can put a strategy in place that has those elements as a part of it, these are great areas of opportunity for procurement. And getting back to where we started, the margins tend to be pretty high. So there's meaningful savings and surprising levels of savings opportunity within these spaces.
Well, and I think you made a really good point with point number 1 about the nuanced understandings, because I mean, think about it. You guys are employing people that have worked in those suppliers. You can't get any more expertise than that. Even if you were to to hire somebody full-time to manage these kind of expenses, even if you're looking at all three categories, from uniform to pest management to waste management. You're not going to have the background and the information potentially that you need on all three to be able to make sure that you're managing those spend categories properly. So
absolutely, Sarah. And you don't want people that have just come up from the sales side of the supplier with their supplier background, because I've seen many times where a salesperson learns the spiel of that supplier, they learn the sales rhetoric. But unless you've had somebody like our VP of Uniform Services and now our COO, Brian Gamble, spent 20 years at Aramark Uniform Services. And during that time period, he did everything from loading pallets on trucks to running routes to running plants to running groups of plants to being a regional vice president over an 8-state region in the Midwest. And that understanding of the plant side, the service side, the very sophisticated cost equation that goes into servicing client accounts is so critical. So you can't, the expertise can't have been gleaned just from selling for a supplier. It has to have been from the operational side. It's critical.
Well, and you can't buy that, or you kind of can by working with Fine Tune. Okay,
it didn't come cheap, but
Mike
yeah,
is
we
chomping
were
at
able
the bit.
to finally.
Come on, Mike. I know you want to weigh in here.
So Rich, real quickly, we only got about 9 minutes left. I want to ask a couple of quick questions for you. So tell me a little bit about if I'm because I'm constantly watching my collaboration channels inside of Procurement Foundry with my entire community, right? And your services, uniform waste removal, uniform management, and
Pest control.
Now you're doing pest control, right?
Yeah.
Consulting. It's consulting and advisory services associated with these nuisance cost structures, right?
Nuance too, though. Yes.
And nuance, yeah, absolutely, right. And protection against distraction is a big thing for me. And you hit the nail on the head on the previous slide where you said associated with value. Restructuring people who are supposed to be working on a $20 million deal and now working on $1 million deal, and they're taking too much time on the $1 million deal. The opportunity cost of not leveraging your time cost of money, right?
Yeah.
So making sure that you got, what I call surgeons washing floors, right? And I mean that with all the affection in the world, which is, hey, I need you working on my $300 million real estate rental agreement, and I need the guy who's working on uniform and pest management, who does this every day and does it with 50 other people working on this, because we look at this once every 3 years. You look at it once every 3 days, right?
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, we can go back forward. In fact, do we have another slide after this or no?
No, it's just the wrap up slide. We finished on the optimistic note, so.
Cool. So I want to make sure I understand a couple of things. This is huge in the manufacturing industry, obviously, right? Because you've got the uniforms that you need for that. Food service, food chains, restaurant chains, things like that. I'm assuming that's huge as well, right?
Yeah, food processing is a wheelhouse business for us. Certainly grocery, automotive parts and service. Life sciences and medical has been a really awesome area for us. In the uniform space, for example, clean room environments are areas where we hit the ball out of the park. And they're also great pest control accounts too. But food processing is certainly wheelhouse business, as you alluded to. Pretty broad spectrum, though. Energy, oil, and gas has been a big winner for us. And yeah, pretty broad spectrum of clientele.
I just want to make sure that for everybody that's listening and everybody who didn't get a chance to come in today, but is going to watch this at some point in the future inside of the Foundry and on our YouTube channels and things like that, that they understand, hey, listen, this is just about every industry has some element to this, right? Like, I didn't even think about life sciences, but you're absolutely right. Laboratory testing coats now, even now with what's happening in the news today, even becomes even more of a concern around getting the right uniforms, getting them clean, getting them out of the building, getting them into the building. And then I thought about, retail. And then if I'm thinking more about waste removal, you get into large office space, intellectual property law firms and consulting firms and advertising firms. And I'm like, I'm sitting here trying to think of an industry you probably don't hit. And I'm like, I don't think there's an industry that you don't hit. So I want to make sure that at least with my last minute on this thing, that I'm making sure that my folks from Procurement Foundry understand that, hey, there's a resource available in this space. We're always looking for outside expertise to help us, solve for pie, right? And help us do vendor management in this space. I personally didn't know that you existed before we met and with Sarah, and I'm really excited about it because I think that I think you can offer some real value to the folks inside of our community. So thank you very much.
Well, and I think there's another note to sort of jump in here on is that they don't just come in and look for the savings. I mean, they come in as a partner and they're continuously doing, the managed services to make sure that the contracts are being upheld, to make sure that your invoices are being done correctly through the nature and the longevity of that contract, right, Rich?
Absolutely, and this is one of the things I'd love to hammer home. I'm glad you opened the door to it. We understand that procurement success can take multiple forms. The savings has to be there. That's how we make our money in a high percentage of our client engagements, and it won't be a success if we don't drive their costs down, but we know we're going to. But where we can really take a happy customer to a delighted customer is by winning over their internal customers in their organizations and leaving them remembering, oh yeah, procurement did something really awesome for me with that initiative surrounding uniforms or pest control. And one of the ways we do that is in the foothills of our process, very early on, we're figuring out who are key stakeholders in the field. We're asking them, hey, tell me a little bit about your biases related to this program. Talk to me about the supplier you've got now. How do you feel about that relationship? Talk to me about experience you've had in the past. And then ultimately tell me what could be better, because we may be able to deliver solutions that not only drive your costs down, but leave you with higher levels of satisfaction, better service than you had the day we met you. We want to hear about that because it helps guide our strategies and leaves us. And frankly, from a selfish standpoint, that's how we get our hooks in account. We get people in the field loving us. But that's a good thing for procurement too, because if the people in the field demand that we stick around, it allows our procurement contacts to stay out of nuisance expenses and to stay focusing on other categories. So I think there's a nice win-win-win relationship there.
Yeah, and
I took that down so we could just see each other for a minute, because we've been in a small little cubicle over here on the side. So I thought, maybe the community wants to see us for a minute.
Great.
Well, and I think just a tangible takeaway, the bottom line is having a strategy across all expenses, not just your highest priority categories, must be a non-negotiable. And I think, closing out on that note, unless you've got anything else to add here, I think is really, really important.
No, you were singing my tune there, Sarah. I've got nothing on top.
I'm a tuner. Apparently, I'm a tuner.
You're a fine tuner.
Anyways, I'm sorry. I had to throw that in. I couldn't help myself. But,
well played. Outstanding.
And just so everybody knows who joined us today, you can actually go and ask Rich and the Fine Tune team any questions that you want. You can meet them in their channel inside the Foundry under #partner_fine-tune, or you can go and check them out on those links that we had provided earlier. Thank you to everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Rich, for a really great presentation. It's been great to really understand nuisance expenses and understand what you guys are doing and how you can help. So I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Mike, and everybody at Procurement Foundry. Really appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thanks,
and for
really
everybody, for everybody who is still online, next week, Procurement Foundry has its first ever virtual conference on the 28th called Forge. I will be hosting the 30-day coronavirus check-in panel, and there are so many more amazing sessions. So go and get your tickets at procurementfoundry.com, and we will see you there.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, Sarah.
Bye,
Great
everybody.
job. Thanks, Rich. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.